What's up, everybody, and welcome back. So we are back at Missouri River Bottom. We were at the family farm getting things rocking and rolling. And, well, we have some changes. So today we are focusing on getting sunflowers in the ground. We're trying out a new crop this year. We're going to see how sunflowers do. Not really something I messed with before, but we're going to figure it out. Grandpa's never run them on the farm. We're going to figure it out. You can see we've already done a little bit of planting. We were just getting the planter, set to depth right, getting it calibrated and everything. I'm finally happy with where it's at. We got it set up, ready to go. So we're going to jump in and get rolling. But as some of you are wondering, I am sure that you're probably wondering how things are looking with the meeting that I had with Dad and Grandpa. Because if you stuck around to the end of last episode, you will know that I got called away from grain selling grain to, go meet with them. So real quick, just to note what you just saw there, we had these two northern fields. The one I talked to the landowner. He owned both those fields, and we kind of put it on a rent to own deal. And then I straight up outright bought the other field next to it, and I combined them both together. So that field, instead of being getting the GPS set up here so everything's right on. But so that field, instead of being about 130 acre, excuse me. Yeah, so that field, instead of being about 110, 115 acres, is now about 150. So that means we're now running where the wheat is at, excuse me. So we got about a 100 acre field there. We've got that 150 acre field. We've got this 190 acre field. And then with some other combinations I've done, as you will see here in the next couple episodes, we've got some other pretty large fields. So that's coming up, something to look forward to, but I'm rambling. I apologize, guys. I kind of get rambling when I get in the tractor, and get relaxed and just start rolling. But so the meeting, here we go. Here's what it is. Grandpa's done. He's out of the hospital. He's doing much better. He's recovering. He's healthy. But he was strongly advised by his doctors to stay home, basically, and to not get back into everyday life on the farm, just due to health concerns, heart and some other things going on. So Grandpa, obviously, if it's time for him to step down, we all knew this day was going to come eventually, but if he knew it was time to step down, so he went to give it to Dad, expected Dad to step up and take over, and Dad told him no. Apparently Dad's at the point where he doesn't mind helping. He'll come out and do things, but he's put himself in a good position. He's ready. He and Mom are ready to kind of retire a little bit and be done with it and move on. We do have a contract going out on this other field. I do have someone out here helping me spray. That's Dad. He's helping spray a little bit. But so here's the kicker. I got Dad helping me here with that contract. And here's the fun part. Nothing good on the farm ever happens without, for any of you who have ever been involved in small town politics, drama, oh Lord, or small time or family farming operations, anytime something like this happens, there's always some silliness, stupidity that follows it. So here's mine that I get to deal with. I now have no help. Dad's helping do that contract, and he's done. He's out. So that's why I am planting all 330 acres of sunflowers today myself. So I'm going to spend quite a bit of time in the tractor. Not a ton of acreage, but still enough that I'm going to get some quality time in this case, that's for sure. Reason being is a couple of the guys that helped were friends of Grandpa's, but they're getting older too, so I get it. Thanks, but no thanks. They're done. They're no longer they're just getting up there in age. They're not interested in doing the work anymore. Totally understand. I'd kind of known about those two going into this last harvest. That was probably going to be it. And they were just driving truck for us, so not a big deal. The big kicker, though, is my uncle is pretty upset that he and his boys didn't get the farm. He thinks they should have got it. He doesn't understand why I'm involved at all and why Dad was given the opportunity first. So now that I have it, he and his boys are out, and well, they've been running around town, running their mouths, and now apparently no one in town wants to help me because they all think I'm pretty shitty. So I got to figure out what I'm going to do. It looks like I'm going to be doing the wheat harvest on my own. Definitely going to be planting, rolling, and doing all that today on my own. So yeah, we got some challenges to figure out, but it is official. This is, once the paperwork goes through, this farm and that wonderful $4.5 million worth of debt that are still hanging over it are all going to be mine. So we might be making some changes. I've got some ideas. I've got some things I kind of wanted to do that I was going to run by Grandpa when he got back. Maybe move some things around a little bit. I don't know. A little bit of foreshadowing there by moving things around, but we'll see what happens. Other than that, we're going to get some. It's been pretty normal. We're going to be filling up a lot. We're going to be running through seed. But other than that, we're going to have a good planting session. So you guys sit back, relax, and enjoy. If you enjoy the video, drop a like on it. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, think about subscribing, share the video. And if you guys have any ideas you think would be fun on this series, or anything you see in my series that you have any questions about or want to know, please feel free to drop a comment down below. I do check comments and respond every time I get one. So other than that, guys, sit back, relax, enjoy, and I'll catch you all at the end. Sunflowers are in the ground. Time to get all the equipment home, get everything washed up, everything put away. Make sure you come back, join me next time. We are going to be going over how wheat harvest went, baling up all that straw. Other than that, you guys have a good one. We'll see you next time.